And our new speaker is Professor Benjamin Murphy from the Florida State University. And his talking is devoted to religion and realism.
Good evening, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk about two of my favorite subjects, logic and religion. And I had last-minute computer problems and had to switch to a different computer, and so hence the delayed opening. So there's been an ongoing debate in Christian philosophical circles about whether Christianity necessarily involves an ontological commitment. Those called realists insist that Christians are committed to the proposition that God really does exist. And then there are those anti-realists who deny that such a commitment is an integral part of Christianity. And there are those, a very significant group, we could call them non-realists, who question the very intelligibility of the whole issue. So Christian realists say God exists. Anti-realists say, well, there's a kind of a sense in which God exists. Realists say, no, God really exists. And then it was Dewey Zephaniah Phillips who said, you can't do philosophy just by using italics, by saying we mean that God really exists. You have to spell out some philosophical theory that tells us what we mean by really in this context. So realists do that. They talk about different theories of truth, for example, truth transcending evidence. And then anti-realists say, but now it looks like you're saying Christianity involves this whole philosophical theory about truth, which we don't actually find anywhere in the Bible. There's a way for realists out of this dilemma. The realist offers a philosophical theory, realism, about the nature of Christian belief, but does not claim that Christians necessarily believe in this theory about the nature of their own belief. The important point is that the philosopher must establish that the realist theory is rooted in and follows from core commitments of Christianity, commitments that are genuinely religious in nature. So what is there in the religious values of Christianity that would give rise to some philosophical theory about Christian belief and the commitments of Christian belief that would deserve the name realist theory? Now, William Alston is a Christian philosopher, advocate of realism, and he suggested that the fundamental motivation for anti-realism might be intolerance to vulnerability. We're tempted to take up a position that is invulnerable to error, where whatever we're saying, when you think about it, we couldn't possibly be wrong to say that. Michael Dummett, who is also a Christian realist, made a similar comment. Yes, those of you who know a little bit about Michael Dummett's philosophy might immediately think, Dummett, isn't he an anti-realist? Because he's best known as an advocate of anti-realism in mathematics. But Dummett did actually argue for a realistic interpretation of the presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. He argued that when we reflect on the history of Eucharistic devotion, this indicates an implicit belief that Jesus is really present in the Blessed Sacrament. And what does it mean to say that Jesus really is present? According to Dummett, it means that I can be accused of a false belief without any misunderstanding being involved. A priest holds up a communion wafer and says, this is the body of Christ. And somebody says, you're mistaken. That is merely a wafer of bread. Now, the priest could say, oh, when I say that it's the body of Christ, I just mean I'm treating it as the body of Christ. Well, nobody could argue the priest is wrong to say, I'm treating it as the body of Christ. That's exactly what makes that an anti-realist theory. Whereas if the priest has a realist theory of the Eucharist, then when somebody says that's not the body of Christ, the priest would say, it is. You are the one who is mistaken when you say that it is merely a wafer. So Alston and Dummett actually both think then that the Christian realist recognizes the possibility of error. Alston's realist acknowledges vulnerability to error, the possibility of doubt. Even though if I were in a state of certainty, Dummett's realist recognizes that you have made a claim that somebody else could see as false without any misunderstanding involved. There's a further motivation for Christian realism pointed out by Simon Blackburn. Now, Blackburn is not Christian. He's not an advocate of any form of Christian theology, but in a discussion about Christian theology and realism, he made a point that I think is pertinent. People often appeal to religion as a form of social legitimation. I assert that I have rights, and somebody asks me to defend that statement. If I defend my rights by saying that, hey, I'm going to stick up for my rights, that's like saying I use this wafer as a symbol. It's a statement of intent. If I say my rights are God-given, and that is to mean something more than I'm going to defend my rights, if it's an explanation, then just as this is the body of Christ must mean more than I take this as the body of Christ, this is my God-given right to be a source of legitimation would have to be more than a statement of intention. This is my right, but I will defend. Now, in the philosophy of mathematics, Dummett argued that the realist is the person who thinks that truth transcends proof, and so adopts a semantical system which justifies classical logic. The anti-realist, on the other hand, thinks that truth must be explained in terms of provability, and so adopts a semantic system that rejects the principle of bivalence. I think we can approach the issue of realism and Christian theology not in exactly the same manner, but in a similar manner. I think of classical semantics as being vanilla semantics, the most basic form of semantics possible, and certainly the most familiar. What we can then consider is not this means that we have to adopt classical semantics, but when you're constructing any semantical theory, you ask yourself, well, why at this point would I depart from classical semantics? So, the realist says that there is something that constitutes my theological statement being wrong. The person who says, I'm mistaken, has not necessarily understood my meaning. There's something that I could have been mistaken about. Now, this means that we are justified in adding a propositional negation operator, a symbol that when added to the assertion of a purported theological truth, turns it into an assertion of precisely what was excluded by the original assertion. So, for any proposition P, there is another proposition, not P, such that in virtue of their content, the two propositions exclude each other. Have I thereby justified the principle of non-contradiction? No. What a principle of exclusion here means is that if I assert both P and not P, then our concepts have broken down because the concepts built on exclusion. But concepts sometimes do break down. A child learns that certain food is hot, hot to touch, hot to taste. Another food is not hot. Then we give the child pepper. In the hand, not hot. In the mouth, hot, hot and not hot. Okay? The concept of hot food that the child has, a simple concept, breaks down. But of course, that breakdown of the concept is a starting point for further refinement. We can introduce the new concept of spicy food. Language goes on. So the argument that I'm advancing here certainly does not establish that the realist should accept the principle of ex contradictione quod libet, also known as explosion, but from a contradiction, everything follows. It doesn't even establish that we can say we should always reject contradictions. A contradiction might play the role of pointing down that our concepts have broken down. But still, even this minimal principle that I'm proposing does make for a clear boundary between realists and non-realists. For an anti-realist, John Computo, for example, it's an important principle that because religious truth is not exclusive, it therefore makes no sense to propose that something said in one religion contradicts something said in another religion. So, of course, if somebody who's a Christian says there is a God, and somebody who's a Buddhist says there is no God, we don't yet know whether they've contradicted each other. What did the Christian mean by God? What did the Buddhist mean by God? Until we're sure of that, we can't be sure that there was a contradiction. But Caputo is not just saying, hey, let's not jump to the conclusion that there's a contradiction until we've checked very carefully. He's saying, well, they're both religious believers. It couldn't possibly be a contradiction. Okay? That is the clear ground between what the realist says about the logic of theological statements and what the anti-realist says. Now, this might be a conclusion that might seem disappointing because it's so trivial, so obvious. Certainly people who classify themselves as analytical theologians, I think, would take this idea that religious statements do sometimes contradict each other and therefore excluded each other for granted. Well, so much the better for analytical theology. Peter Byrne has argued that Christians are committed to realism, but Christian theology fails to live up to that commitment, and that the danger is that Christian theology will just be a series of hopeful daydreams, wishes that people might express. The way to start avoiding that accusation, the way to show that you're serious about being realist in Christian theology, is to make use of basic logical principles. And today, World Logic Day, I think it's the perfect day to try to put some logic back into theology. And I will make another point about the considerations that I have advanced here. And that is, although when I was illustrating what's at stake, I used the example of a disagreement about God, the argument appealed to certain features of Christian discourse, that Christians sometimes have doubts, so they know what they say is possibly wrong. That Christians, even if they don't have doubts, accept the possibility that other people will contradict them. Indeed, Christians tend to expect that if you really say the truth, almost certainly somebody will contradict you. Criticism of truth is to be expected. And finally, that Christians do sometimes appeal to Christianity as a source of social legitimation. The concept of God didn't actually play any role in the argument. I wasn't so much talking about what does it mean to say that God really exists, as just what does it mean to say that our beliefs are really true. And so it is entirely possible that the arguments that I have said here can be applied within Christian theology, could be applied within other religions as well. And after that, rushed through the talk to make up for the late beginning, and I'm open to questions.
Okay, it seems that our chair is not here, so I'll play the role of the chair. So, does anyone have any question? Okay, I have a question which perhaps not directly related to what you said, but it concerns the topic itself. So when you try to formalize, let's say, the claims of different religious traditions, or even if you try to formalize or to make it clear what concepts of different religions really mean, we get into something close to contradiction, right? You agree on that?
Yes.
So and this it seems to independ on the position of that someone holds, whether or not he or she is a realist, or he or she is not a realist. So how you respond to that?
Okay. Now, I think if we can clarify the connections between the semantics, the logic, and the core commitments of a religion, we can create a situation where you have to say either, I no longer accept the core commitments of the religion, the task is to show within a religion there's a set of core commitments. And you can show, I think, that certain philosophical positions, properly understood, are incompatible with those core commitments.
Okay. Okay, it seems our chair is back. Yeah, here he is.
Yeah, I had some problems with the internet. So my question is, usually realism isn't connected to religion, because religion is a kind of thinking, supernaturalistic thinking, and super realistic thinking. So, but on the other hand, in religion we can see some approaches to real phenomena also. So how do you think about this deep contradiction, realism and religion?
I guess we've both come from different philosophical worlds, because realism, in the sense of, now, all that realism means in the way I'm using it is you acknowledge that you have an ontological commitment. And I think of that as actually being the default position. I mean, you know, I'm a Christian and I say, yes, I believe that God exists. That sounds like an ontological commitment. Now, okay, I know there are people who can say you can find a way to make that claim without actually making an ontological commitment. That's what philosophers do in lots of situations. But I don't think it is particularly the strange or unusual position to say that what appears to be an ontological commitment there really is. Unless, of course, in what do you understand realism to mean? Because the word can mean so many things.
Usually, realism is understood in the way that there are phenomena outside me and outside of any spirit, and and they are mirrored in our mind, in our feelings, and so on.
Okay, yes, that would be realism about the physical world. Some background that I may be taking for granted is the whole Michael Dummett approach to issues of realism, anti-realism. And even if you're familiar with it, some people might not be. The idea is that there's a lot of philosophical debates that run in parallel. One person says numbers are real. The other says, no, they're not. There you have a realist about numbers and an anti-realist about numbers. Okay, you have somebody who says the physical world really exists. Somebody else says, no, it does not. The physicalist versus the idealist. And in fact, and then you have a debate. Somebody says, God really exists. No, God does not. Theological realist versus theological anti-realist. And you could be a realist in one debate, but not in another. Notably, Dummett himself is very much an idealist about the physical world in a lot of what he says, an intuitionist, anti-realist about numbers, but a realist when it comes to theology. So that would be the position I'd advocate.
Okay, so I can add that, for example, in German, the notion, the existence of God is uttered Dasein des Gottes, but this notion Dasein, it means that something is da, something is present in the meaning of real entities and real phenomena. And evidently there is also a kind of contradiction, how it is possible that the Lord is da, that the Lord is present like other real things. So
okay, yeah, and my analysis of realism, it kind of bypasses that particular idea of being there, Dasein. It just says that statements made about God are true statements that do not depend on human beings to make them true. But all human beings could cease to exist, but God would still be there. But I fell into the trap there. I did end up by saying that God would still be there. But this is where the analogy with numbers does come in helpful. I mean, Dummett is not a realist about numbers, but we've got this idea of this is what it would mean to be a realist about numbers. And numbers definitely are not physical objects. They're not virklich, they're not actual. And yet we understand what somebody means when they're saying that numbers are real. So we don't have to assign God a physical location to say God is real.
Yeah, I agree. I see maybe there is a question from Billy Moria. Please, you are welcome, Billy Moria.
Yeah. Okay. Just a very quick question. As I understand, realism, a claim to realism is about independence, as in the last question someone mentioned too, things existing independent of the mind. Now, I think Dummett has a kind of a two-faced realism, or realism and irrealism. He seems to be irrealist about numbers and about the world, about things, a bit like Putnam. That is very interesting, of course. But he seems to be realist about God. You have that in the Nyaya in Indian philosophy as well, where the world is a real existing thing outside of God's mind. It's not an idealist. It's not like Bishop Berkeley. Things are not just not an impersonalist like Shankara, where there really is no God. It's just the creation of our own mind. But in fact, no, God exists independently of the world, and the world exists independently of God. However, we in the world only have non-realist access to the world. In other words, things actually, while we're in the world, do not exist outside of our mind. They really are just projections or creations or ideas in our mind. So we're subjected to a Bishop Berkeley world, basically. Now, is that how I would understand the seemingly contradictory position that Putnam, and to an extent Hilary Putnam later in his life, also has about about metaphysics?
Well, let me just fill in a bit more on Dummett and the world. Dummett says that we live in the same world insofar as we are capable of communicating with each other. Therefore, different animal species we would naturally take to be living in different worlds, were it not for the fact that there is one mind that combines all of these worlds, the mind of God. Furthermore, God cannot create a world that is uninhabited. So what Dummett seems to think is something exists insofar as it can be perceived by two different beings. God hasn't made a world until that world includes within it minds that perceive the world. So I think Dummett actually does come really quite close to Bishop Berkeley there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your very interesting talking and about very important question, philosophical question for us. What does it mean to be, and how it is connected to religion? It is very important for our session. Thank you so much.